The phone rang. An unknown number on the display. A string of digits I didn't recognize, couldn't possibly recognize. For 20 years, the world of him had been a carefully sealed box, tucked away in the darkest corner of my mind, gathering dust like forgotten memories. 20 years. 2 decades. A lifetime. Almost. Lived without the weight of his presence, without the sharp edges of his absence carving hollows into my days. I hesitated, my finger hovering over the green answer icon. Who calls from out of state these days without sending a text first? It felt archaic, or perhaps desperate. A tremor, faint but insistent, traced its way up my arm. It wasn't fear, not anymore. It was something older, something akin to the involuntary flinch one makes before an unexpected loud noise, even when you know it can't hurt you. Curiosity, perhaps. Or maybe just a morbid fascination with the past refusing to stay buried. I answered. His voice, when it came, was a ghost. Thinner than I remembered, stripped of the booming confidence, the easy charm that had once pulled me under like a strong current. It was reedy, hesitant, laced with a vulnerability I had never heard in the years we were married, not even when things were falling apart. "Eleanor?" he whispered. The single word carrying the weight of 20 years. 20 years of silence, 20 years of curated forgetting. He still used my full name, just as he always had. My breath hitched. I hadn't expected this. Not ever. Not after everything. My carefully constructed composure, built brick by painstaking brick over years of silent struggle, threatened to crumble. I gripped the phone tighter, knuckles white against the cool plastic. "Robert," I managed, my own voice surprisingly steady, cool, a stark contrast to the tempest swirling inside me. The name felt foreign on my tongue, tasting of ash and old tears. There was a beat of silence, stretching taut like a pulled thread, before he spoke again. "Eleanor?" he repeated, the name a plea this time, raw and unmistakable. "It's me," as if I didn't know. As if the sound of his voice wasn't a physical blow, resonating deep in my bones, stirring the sediment of 2 decades of pain. I closed my eyes for a moment, picturing the man he had been, handsome, ambitious, utterly convinced of his own invincibility, the man who had walked away from everything, from us without a backward glance, leaving me to pick up the pieces of a life he had shattered. What could he possibly want now? After all this time? The sheer audacity of it stole my breath. The silence stretched again, punctuated only by the faint static on the line, the distance tangible between us. The sun slanted through my kitchen window, warming the worn wood of the table, a scene of quiet domesticity he had abandoned. It was a life I had built, piece by piece from the wreckage he left behind, a life he had no part of, no claim to. "I know it's you, Robert," I said, my voice even, perhaps a little too even. A shield. To what do I owe this call? After 20 years, the question hung in the air, heavy with unspoken history, with all the bitterness and grief and quiet fury I had buried over the years. I didn't offer him an opening, a polite bridge across the chasm he had created. He had to cross it himself, if he dared. He cleared his throat, a dry, rasping sound. I need your help, Eleanor." The words landed in the quiet kitchen like stones dropped into still water, sending ripples through the carefully maintained calm. Help? From me? The woman he had left penniless, heartbroken, and alone? The irony was a bitter, almost gagging taste in my mouth. The woman he had systematically stripped of everything: financial security, emotional stability, her very sense of self-worth. He needed her help. It was a twist of fate so cruel, so perfectly symmetrical in its injustice. It almost made me laugh. Almost. Instead, a cold, hard knot formed in my stomach. This was not a pleasant blast from the past. This was something else entirely. Something that felt dangerous. Even now, 20 years later, the past had come calling. Not with apologies or explanations, but with a hand held out, asking for a lifeline from the very person he had pushed into the abyss. 20 years ago, The world had ended, not with a bang, but with the quiet click of a lock and the retreating sound of footsteps on a gravel drive. Robert had packed his bags, meticulously, calmly, as if preparing for a business trip, not abandoning his life. He'd stood in the doorway, the afternoon sun behind him, casting his face in shadow, making it impossible to read. His eyes, usually so expressive, were flat, empty. He'd said something about needing space, needing to find himself, the kind of cliché that felt particularly cruel in its banality. It wasn't just me he was leaving. It was the house we'd built together, the garden I'd poured my soul into, the quiet rhythm of our shared existence. But mostly it was me. He was leaving me, and it wasn't just emotional abandonment. No, Robert was thorough. He left me the house. Yes, but it was a house drowning in a mortgage he had secretly refinanced multiple times. He left me the car which had recently died. He left me the shared bank account conveniently emptied. He left me with a stack of bills I didn't know existed, debts he had accrued in my name, debts that felt like concrete blocks tied to my ankles. He left me with nothing but a broken heart and a mountain of his financial wreckage. The worst part wasn't the money, although that nearly broke me in the early days. It was the cold calculation of it. The way he had planned it, siphoning off funds, setting up accounts I didn't know about, slowly, methodically for months, maybe even years, before he walked out the door. It wasn't a sudden, desperate act. It was a deliberate strategy, a divestment. I was an asset that had depreciated, a liability he was shedding. That realization, that I had been so utterly deceived, so completely blind to the true nature of the man I had loved, the man I had built my life around, that was the deepest wound. It festered, poisoning my view of the world, making trust a foreign concept. For a long time I felt like a fool, an unsuspecting mark in a con I didn't even know was being run. My friends offered platitudes. Advice? My family? Well, they were mostly silent, embarrassed by the spectacle of my failure. His family, the charming, polished facade they presented, vanished into thin air, their sympathy a paper-thin pretense that evaporated the moment his car was out of sight. I was utterly alone, adrift in the ruins. The house, the symbolic object I now clung to with a fierce, desperate grip, was both my cage and my sanctuary. Every room held a memory, a ghost of the life we had shared, a life that was now revealed to be a carefully constructed illusion. The kitchen where we'd planned futures, the living room where we'd sat in comfortable silence, the bedroom where he had whispered promises that turned out to be lies. It was haunted, and the weight of the mortgage, the bills, the debt he left behind was crushing. I remember sitting on the floor in the empty living room the day after he left, surrounded by the silence that screamed his absence louder than any noise. I had cried until there were no tears left, until my chest ached with the effort of breathing. And then something shifted. A cold, hard anger began to crystallize in the core of that aching emptiness. Not just anger at him, but anger at myself. For being so naive, for being so weak, for letting someone else's choices dictate my destruction. That anger became my fuel. There was no safety net, no family fortune to fall back on, no generous settlement. Just me, the house, and a mountain of debt. I got a second job, then a third. I learned to budget down to the penny, to stretch every dollar until it screamed. I sold things, his things, my things, anything that wasn't essential. The beautiful antique desk he'd inherited, gone. My small collection of jewelry, pawned. Pride was a luxury I couldn't afford. Survival was the only currency. The house, though it represented so much pain, also represented my last link to stability. Losing it was not an option, so I fought for it. I navigated the predatory world of debt collectors, the confusing language of foreclosures. I learned to be tough, to stand my ground, to demand what little fairness I was due. The quiet strength the Jason profile mentions? It wasn't innate. It was forged in the fire of those early years, hammered out on the anvil of necessity and betrayal. It was the strength born of having no other choice but to put one foot in front of the other, even when every step felt like walking on broken glass. I became a woman I didn't recognize. Harder, more resilient, with a core of steel where softness used to be. And slowly, painstakingly, I began to rebuild. Not just my finances, but myself. The scars remained deep and undeniable, but the wounds began to heal. The ghost of him still lingered in the corners of the house, but its hold lessened with every bill paid, every repair made with my own two hands, every quiet evening spent reclaiming the space as mine. Over the next 20 years, my life became defined by a quiet, steady progression. The mountain of debt shrank, then disappeared. The house, once a symbol of ruin, became a testament to resilience. I didn't just keep it, I transformed it. I stripped away the layers of his taste, his influence, and made it truly mine. I painted the walls in colors he would have hated, filled the rooms with objects that held meaning only for me. The garden, once a shared project, became my solitary passion, a place of peace and growth. I poured the energy I had once spent on him into nurturing living things. Roses bloomed, vegetables thrived, and I found a quiet satisfaction in the rhythm of the seasons, in the tangible results of my labor. I built a career for myself, not in the field I had once dreamed of, but in something practical, something that provided security. It wasn't glamorous, but it was mine, earned through hard work and determination. I learned to rely on myself, to trust my own judgment. A stark contrast to the woman who had once placed her entire faith in a man who proved utterly untrustworthy. I didn't remarry, didn't even seriously date. The scars ran too deep. The idea of vulnerability, of giving someone else that kind of power over my life, felt terrifying. I built a small circle of close friends, women who had their own stories of resilience, who understood the quiet battles fought behind closed doors. We weren't a pity party, we were a support group, sharing strength, celebrating small victories. My life was perhaps smaller than the one I had once envisioned, but it was stable, peaceful, mine. I had learned the hard way that the greatest security came from within, from knowing your own capabilities, from being able to stand on your own 2 feet. I had become the kind of woman the Jason profile described, older perhaps, marked by betrayal, but quietly strong. I had not only survived, I had thrived in my own quiet way. I wasn't rich by conventional standards, but I was solvent, secure, and most importantly free. Free from debt, free from deceit, free from the constant anxiety that had plagued me in the early years. My house, my garden, my financial stability, these were not just possessions, they were badges of honor, proof of my resilience, monuments to the fact that I had been broken, but not destroyed. And then, that phone call, his voice, bringing the past crashing into the present, disrupting the carefully cultivated peace of 2 decades. His need for help. The words echoed in my mind, absurd and infuriating. Robert, the man who had left me to drown, was asking me to throw him a lifeline. What could possibly have brought him to this point? Robert, the charming, invincible Robert, reduced to begging. The silence stretched again, filled with the unasked questions. The years of hurt. I took a deep breath, grounding myself in the present moment, in the solid reality of my quiet kitchen, my secure life. This was not 20 years ago. I was not the same woman. I was not the naive, vulnerable victim he had abandoned. Help? I repeated, the word flat, devoid of emotion. I wouldn't give him the satisfaction of hearing the shock, the anger, the myriad of conflicting feelings swirling inside me. What kind of help, Robert? I needed details, needed to understand the depth of his predicament, the nature of his desperation. He hesitated again, the hesitation speaking volumes. It was clear this call was difficult for him, humiliating even. Good. He deserved a little humiliation. It's financial, Eleanor, he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. Financial. Of course, it was financial. It always had been, at the core of it. His ambition, his risk-taking, his casual disregard for consequences, especially when those consequences fell on someone else. I'm in trouble. Bad trouble. The words tumbled out, A torrent of desperation replacing the earlier hesitation. Legal trouble. Business trouble. Everything's collapsing. He painted a picture of ruin, of deals gone bad, of lawsuits, of banks closing in. He had clearly flown too close to the sun, chasing the high-stakes world he had left me behind to pursue. The irony was thick enough to cut with a knife. He had abandoned me for the promise of wealth and success, and now that pursuit had led him to ruin. And he was coming to me, of all people, for help navigating the financial and legal mess he had made. Me, the woman he had left to drown in his debt. Me, the woman who had spent 20 years painstakingly clawing her way back to solvency. The woman who knew, intimately, the kind of destruction financial irresponsibility could wreak. He talked about needing a large sum of money, quickly, to stave off a lawsuit, to prevent foreclosure on something. He was vague on the specifics, skirting around the details. His inherent slipperiness still evident even in his desperation. He was still trying to control the narrative. Even now, even when he was at his most vulnerable. He mentioned needing access to certain funds, certain accounts. As he spoke, a seed of an idea began to form in my mind, a cold, calculating thought that sent a shiver down my spine. He was talking about funds, accounts, something from 20 years ago, something that had been part of the mess he left me with. I listened, my silence encouraging him to reveal more, to dig himself deeper into the hole of his own making. He talked about a specific property, a development deal that had gone south, and how this property was now crucial to his survival. A property, 20 years ago, could it be? He finally revealed the core of his problem. It was related to a tangled web of investments and debts connected to a piece of real estate, a large tract of land outside the city. He needed a substantial amount of money, yes. But more specifically, he needed access to a particular legal and financial structure tied to that property, something complex and obscure that could potentially unlock the funds he needed or provide leverage against his creditors. And this structure, he claimed, was something only I, due to some technicality related to the original dissolution of our assets, had the legal standing to interact with. He glossed over the details, of course, making it sound like a mere bureaucratic hurdle, a simple signature I needed to provide, a small favor for an old acquaintance. But I heard the tremor in his voice, the carefully concealed desperation. This was no small favor. This was his last chance. The property, the development, it clicked into place with a sickening lurch. 20 years ago, when he was engineering his departure, Robert had been heavily invested in a speculative land deal, convinced it would make him a fortune. He had leveraged everything, including assets that were technically mine, without my knowledge or consent. When he left, he'd effectively abandoned that deal too, along with the associated debts and liabilities, leaving them tangled up with the wreckage of our shared finances. I had assumed, through the haze of my own financial crisis, that the deal had simply collapsed, that the land had been foreclosed upon, another casualty of his recklessness. But he was talking about it now, 20 years later, as if it still held some potential value, some hidden key. He was talking about a legal structure, a technicality involving me. My mind raced, piecing together fragmented memories of documents I barely understood at the time. Papers I had signed under duress or in ignorance during the chaotic period of his departure. There was something he didn't know, something he couldn't know. When he left, overwhelmed by the sheer volume of debt and the complexity of the situation, I had sought help from a pro bono legal aid service. A sharp young lawyer there had noticed something in the reams of paperwork Robert had left behind, something related to that land deal, a specific clause, a peculiar type of holding entity Robert had set up. It seemed insignificant at the time, a technicality buried in the mess. But this lawyer, Sarah, had seen something in it. A potential loophole, a possibility, however remote, of salvaging something from the absolute disaster. She'd advised me to do something unorthodox, something that felt risky and complicated amidst the crushing weight of everything else. She had guided me through a series of obscure legal maneuvers, using the very technicality Robert had carelessly left in place, to quietly disentangle my theoretical stake in that tangled deal from his collapsing empire. It had cost me the last of my meager savings for filing fees and incidentals, and it had felt like a shot in the dark, a desperate gamble with no guarantee of success. But Sarah had been insistent, her eyes sharp and knowing. "He thinks this is worthless, Eleanor," she told me, pointing to a specific document. "He's wrong, or at least he could be wrong, and even if it is worthless now, controlling this specific piece might just give you an option, down the line, an option he won't have." I had followed her advice, going through the motions like a sleepwalker, too numb from the shock of betrayal to fully grasp the implications. The process had been slow, agonizingly complicated, and completely separate from the more immediate crisis of keeping the roof over my head. For years after, the existence of that obscure legal entity, that technical stake in a forgotten land deal, had been just another piece of paperwork gathering dust, another unresolved loose end from the nightmare of my divorce. I had frankly forgotten about it, buried under the demands of simply surviving, until now. Until Robert called, 20 years later, desperate for access to that very thing. He was still talking, rambling about the urgency, the catastrophic consequences if he didn't get my help. He spoke of ruin, of losing everything, his voice cracking with what sounded like genuine fear. The Robert I knew was fearless, arrogant. To hear him this way, it was a revelation. He was cornered, desperate, and apparently he had finally run out of people to manipulate. He circled back to the technicality, the simple signature, emphasizing how easy it would be for me, how it wouldn't cost me anything, how he would be eternally grateful, eternally grateful. The words hung in the air, dripping with a false sincerity that was all too familiar. He made it sound like a minor inconvenience for me, a mere formality to help him out of a jam. He had no idea that I hadn't just survived the financial ruin he left me. I had quietly, painstakingly built something from the ashes he created, something that apparently held the key to his salvation, the specific legal structure he needed access to, the one only I had the standing to interact with. That was the entity Sarah had helped me secure control of. 20 years ago, he thought it was a forgotten piece of bureaucracy, a vestige of the past that needed my technical sign-off. He didn't know that I owned it, not just the abstract legal entity, but through that entity I had quietly acquired a controlling interest in the property itself. Years ago, when it went through a complicated legal limbo, and was available for pennies on the dollar to those with specific, obscure claims. My gamble, the one Sarah had guided me through, had paid off in a way I had never anticipated. I hadn't bought it out of spite or revenge. I had done it as a desperate, long-shot attempt to salvage some sliver of value from the financial devastation he had wrought. It had sat there, dormant, a forgotten investment, while I focused on the everyday struggle of rebuilding my life. Now it wasn't just a forgotten asset, it was his lifeline. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. All this time, while he was off chasing his fortunes, believing he had left me with nothing of value, I had unknowingly held a piece of his future in my hands. The irony was breathtaking. He had tried to strip me bare, to leave me with nothing, and in his haste, his arrogance, he had overlooked a small, obscure detail that had grown, over 2 decades, into the very thing he now desperately needed. He had engineered his escape, tied up his loose ends poorly, and one of those loose ends had quietly, patiently, grown into a rope that he now needed to climb out of the pit he had dug for himself, and I was holding the other end. "Eleanor? Are you there?" His voice jolted me back to the present. I must have been silent for too long, lost in the maze of memory and staggering realization. "Yes, Robert, I'm here." My voice was stronger now, infused with a quiet certainty that hadn't been there moments before. The fear, the uncertainty, the old pain, they were still present, but they were now overlaid with something else. A sense of profound, unexpected power. He needed my help. He needed access to something I controlled, something I owned, thanks to his own recklessness and my quiet resilience. "So, can you help me? It's urgent, Eleanor. I'm facing bankruptcy. Ruin." He laid it out, his desperation palpable. He needed me to sign documents to make a legal appearance, to essentially activate the obscure legal structure I controlled, the one that was tied to the land deal, the one that could potentially save him. He still didn't understand the depth of my involvement, the extent of my control. He saw me as a passive obstacle, a bureaucratic formality. He had no idea I was the gatekeeper. The thought sent a chill down my spine. But it wasn't fear this time. It was exhilaration, a dark, intoxicating sense of having the tables turned, of holding all the cards. "I need to think about this, Robert," I said slowly, choosing my words carefully. I couldn't reveal my hand yet. He needed to sweat. He needed to fully understand the gravity of his situation and the fact that his fate rested entirely in my hands. "It's been 20 years. This isn't a small thing you're asking." I let the unspoken weight of those years hang in the air. "Can you explain it to me properly? The details? The specific legal entity you're talking about?" "I don't have access to the old paperwork." A small lie. I had all the paperwork meticulously filed away, the documents that proved my ownership, my control. But I needed him to provide the context, to confirm that what he needed was indeed the thing I held. He hesitated, clearly reluctant to give up more details, to reveal the full extent of his mess to the woman he had wronged. But his desperation won out. He began to explain, haltingly at first, then with increasing urgency, the convoluted history of the land deal, the specific legal entity he had set up back then, its current status, and why he needed me to intercede now. As he spoke, my certainty solidified. He was describing exactly the entity Sarah had helped me acquire, the one he thought was a forgotten technicality, a liability he had offloaded. He had no idea that I hadn't just navigated the mess. I had quietly taken control of a key piece of it. He had left me the wreckage, and I had found a hidden blueprint within it, a way to not just survive, but to build something he never intended for me to have. So I said, cutting him off after he finished his explanation, the silence on the line heavy with expectation, "You need me to exercise my legal authority over the Phoenix Trust?"
I used the name Sarah, and I had given the entity a small private joke about rising from ashes. He hadn't used the name, just a generic description. The name confirmed it. It was the Phoenix Trust. My trust. My silent, hidden asset. "Yes," he exclaimed, relief flooding his voice. He clearly thought I was confirming I remembered the entity, that I was starting to understand. He had no idea that I knew more about the Phoenix Trust than he ever did.
"Exactly. The Phoenix Trust. You're listed as the controller due to a clause in the original setup and the way things were dissolved. It's just a technicality, but only you can sign off on this. Only you can access the underlying leverage." Leverage. Yes. The leverage he had been so desperate to hide from me 20 years ago, the potential value he had tried to keep for himself, was now entirely within my control. He had inadvertently handed me the keys to his kingdom, or at least the keys to unlocking his current predicament. When he abandoned me, it wasn't just ironic, it was poetic. "And if I don't?" I asked, my voice soft, but laced with an unspoken steel. The question hung in the air, a challenge, a test of his desperation. He stammered, clearly taken aback. He hadn't anticipated resistance. He had probably expected me to be easily swayed, perhaps still pining for him, or simply overwhelmed by his sudden reappearance. He had underestimated me, just as he always had. "Eleanor, please," he pleaded, the last vestiges of his charm falling away, revealing the raw fear underneath. "If you don't, I lose everything. My company, my home, everything I've built, everything he'd built, on the ruins of the life he'd destroyed. People will come after me. I could go to jail." Jail. The word hung there, stark and chilling. This was serious. This wasn't just about money anymore. "All you have to do is sign. Meet with my lawyer. It's a few pieces of paper. It costs you nothing." He kept repeating that as if the cost was the only thing that mattered. He still didn't understand. It wasn't about the money I would have to spend. It was about the price he had already exacted. The price of 20 years of struggle, of pain, of rebuilding. It cost me nothing? I repeated, my voice rising slightly, the carefully constructed calm beginning to fray at the edges. It cost me nothing, Robert. You walk out, leave me with mountains of debt, with nothing, with a life I had to claw back from the brink. And you call asking for a simple signature, saying it cost me nothing? The bitterness I had held at bay for 20 years threatened to spill over. Do you have any idea what those 20 years were like? Do you think I just moved on? Found someone new? Forgot everything you did? The dam was breaking. The quiet strength was giving way to the raw emotion he had suppressed for so long. He was silent on the other end, perhaps genuinely shocked by the intensity of my reaction, or perhaps just waiting for the storm to pass so he could resume his pleading. Eleanor, I know I messed up, he finally said, his voice subdued. I regret how I left things. Truly I do. Regret? After 20 years? When his own carefully constructed world was collapsing? The timing was impeccable. His regret wasn't for the pain he had caused. It was for the consequences he was now facing. It was regret, born of self-preservation, not remorse. I didn't believe him for a second. Regret changes nothing, Robert, I said, my voice cold and hard now. The anger had settled into a steely resolve. He needed the Phoenix Trust. The Phoenix Trust was mine. And 20 years ago, he had left me with nothing, believing I was incapable of rising from the ashes he had created. He was about to learn how wrong he was. He was about to receive a surprise, not the kind of help he was begging for, not a simple bailout delivered with a magnanimous wave of my hand. No, he was about to face the consequences of his actions, delivered by the very person he had underestimated and discarded. I can help you, Robert, I said, my voice dangerously quiet. I can activate the Phoenix Trust. I can sign the papers. I can do what you need. A wave of relief, swift and palpable, washed over his voice. Oh, Eleanor, thank you. Thank you so much. I knew I could count on you. I don't know how I can ever repay you. He was already back to his old self, spinning promises, assuming I would just roll over. But I cut him off. However, I continued, the word a sharp little edge, cutting through his premature gratitude. The silence returned, tense and expectant. However, I repeated, letting the word hang in the air. My help comes at a price, he stammered, confused. A price? But you said, it costs you nothing. He still didn't get it. He was still thinking in terms of simple transactions, of money changing hands. He had no concept of the currency of pain, of the cost of betrayal. Not a financial price, Robert, I clarified, my voice low and deliberate. A different kind of price. I could almost hear his mind working, calculating, trying to figure out what I could possibly want from him after all this time. Did I want money? An apology? Revenge? He wouldn't guess. He couldn't. His imagination wasn't big enough to encompass the scale of what I had endured, or the quiet power I had cultivated. I need you to understand something, Robert, I said, my voice gaining strength, becoming the voice of the woman I had become, not the girl he had left behind. 20 years ago, you didn't just leave me. You tried to erase me. You stripped away my financial security, my sense of self, my future as I saw it. You left me with nothing but debt and the wreckage of my life. I paused, letting the weight of those words sink in. But you failed. You didn't erase me. I survived. I fought. I rebuilt. And in the process, I ended up with something you thought was worthless, something you abandoned. The Phoenix Trust. His silence on the other end was absolute now. He was listening, finally, not just hearing, but listening. The tone of my voice, the reference to the trust, the history I was recounting, it was starting to dawn on him. That technicality you mentioned, I continued, my voice cold and sharp as ice. It wasn't a technicality, Robert. It was a loophole I used, with the help of a very clever lawyer. I paused again, letting the tension build. While you were off building your empire, believing you'd left me with nothing, I was quietly securing control of that trust. I wasn't just listed as a controller due to some forgotten clause. I became the sole legal owner. Years ago, the silence on the other end was deafening. The air crackled with unspoken shock. I could almost hear his world tilting on its axis. The impossible was happening. The woman he had discarded, the one he thought he could simply ask for a favor from, was revealing herself to be the unexpected owner of his lifeline. "You don't just need me to sign papers, Robert," I stated, the power in my voice now undeniable. "You need me to allow you to access the leverage within the trust. You need my consent, my approval, my choice." I let the word hang in the air. Choice. He had taken away my choices 20 years ago. Now I held all of his in my hand. "And my price is this," I said, my voice dropping to a low, resonant tone. "I will meet with your lawyer. I will review the documents. If I agree to help you, to allow you access to the trust, it will be under my terms, and my terms are non-negotiable." I didn't reveal the terms yet, not over the phone. He needed to come to me, to come into my world, on my terms, after 20 years of arrogant absence. He finally spoke, his voice strained, disbelieving. You own it, the Phoenix Trust? But how?" He couldn't comprehend it. It was outside the realm of his understanding. The idea that the woman he had dismissed as insignificant could have quietly maneuvered herself into a position of such power over something he needed. "That," I said, a hint of a smile playing on my lips, a smile he couldn't see but could perhaps hear in the triumph in my voice, "is the surprise, Robert." It wasn't the surprise he had expected. He'd expected a yes or a no, perhaps a bitter refusal or a reluctant agreement. He hadn't expected me to reveal myself as the unexpected owner of his salvation, forged from the very ruins he had created. "You want to discuss terms?" he asked, his voice tight with suppressed fear and dawning comprehension. "You want to—" "There are no negotiations, Robert," I stated clearly. "My terms are fixed. You will hear them, and you will decide if your need is great enough to accept them. If you don't accept them, the Phoenix Trust remains dormant, and whatever happens to you, happens." I left the unspoken threat hanging in the air. This wasn't revenge, not in the simple, petty sense. This was about justice, about reclaiming the power that had been stolen from me, about showing him the consequences of his actions, delivered with quiet, implacable force. We agreed to meet, not at a neutral location, not on his territory, at my lawyer's office, downtown, a place that felt formal, serious, a stage for the inversion of power. I chose a lawyer I had worked with more recently, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Brenda, who knew nothing of my history with Robert, but specialized in complex financial and legal matters. I would tell her only what was necessary. This was my moment, my surprise to deliver. "Send the relevant documents to my lawyer, Brenda Hayes." I instructed him, giving him her contact information. "She will review them. Then we will meet. You, your lawyer, Brenda, and me, and you will hear my terms." He agreed, his voice subdued, the earlier arrogance completely gone, replaced by a wary uncertainty. The phone call ended, leaving a profound silence in its wake. I sat there for a long time, the phone still in my hand, the silence of my kitchen amplifying the whirlwind of emotions inside me. 20 years, all the pain, the struggle, the quiet rebuilding. It had led to this, a moment of reckoning, a chance to deliver a surprise, rooted not in bitterness, but in the quiet strength I had built. It wasn't the explosive revenge of fiction, it was the slow, steady bloom of justice, cultivated over 2 decades of hard work and resilience. He had left me with nothing but ruins, and from those ruins I had unknowingly built the very thing he now needed to survive. The Phoenix Trust. It wasn't just a legal entity, it was a symbol of my survival, my resilience, my unexpected quiet power. Brenda was efficient and professional. I gave her a brief, stripped-down version of the history. My ex-husband, a divorce 20 years ago, a complex financial mess left behind, and an obscure legal entity I had acquired control of during that time. I told her he had contacted me, needing access to this entity to resolve his current legal troubles, and that I was considering helping him, but on my terms. I didn't need to tell her about the betrayal, the pain. The documents Robert sent spoke volumes. Brenda, with her sharp legal mind, quickly saw the power I held. The Phoenix Trust, once a marginal asset, had, due to the tangled history of the land and subsequent legal developments, become a critical piece of the puzzle for anyone trying to gain control or resolve disputes related to the property. Robert, in his haste and arrogance 20 years ago, had not only left this key piece behind, but had structured it in such a way that only my involvement could unlock its potential now. Brenda confirmed that yes, legally, I held all the cards. He needed my explicit consent, my active participation to leverage the trust. Without me, his claim, his defense, whatever he was trying to do would likely collapse. He's painted himself into a corner, Eleanor, Brenda said, leaning back in her chair, her expression thoughtful. And you inadvertently are holding the brush. The irony wasn't lost on her either. So what are your terms? She asked, her gaze steady. This was the crucial part. What did I want? Money? An apology? Humiliation? Simple revenge felt inadequate. It wouldn't erase the past, wouldn't heal the scars. The true surprise wasn't just that I owned the key. It was what I would do with it. My terms had to reflect the journey of the past 20 years. The lessons learned, the strength gained. They had to be about more than just evening the score. My terms coalesced over the next few days, solidifying from the swirling emotions of anger, hurt, and quiet triumph. They weren't about personal gain, not in the way Robert would understand it. They were about accountability, about facing the consequences, about ensuring that what happened to me couldn't happen to someone else, and about acknowledging the hidden costs of his reckless ambition. I outlined my terms to Brenda, and she listened, a flicker of surprise in her eyes, followed by a slow nod of understanding. That's comprehensive, Eleanor, she said, a small knowing smile touching her lips. And perfectly within your rights. The meeting was set for the following week. Robert, his lawyer, Brenda, and me. In Brenda's conference room, a space that felt sterile and professional, a stark contrast to the emotional battlefield this meeting represented. I dressed carefully, choosing an outfit that was simple, understated, but projected quiet confidence. No power suit, no attempt to imitate the corporate world he inhabited, just me, grounded and steady. I arrived early, sitting beside Brenda at the large polished table, the documents spread out before us. When Robert and his lawyer arrived, I felt a jolt, seeing him after 20 years. He looked smaller, thinner, lines etched around his eyes and mouth that spoke of stress and worry. The easy charm was gone, replaced by a forced politeness, a nervous energy that was a world away from the arrogant man who had walked out my door. His lawyer, a man who looked perpetually uncomfortable, shook hands stiffly. Robert avoided my eyes, his gaze flitting nervously around the room. We sat. The silence was thick with unspoken history. Brenda, ever professional, initiated the proceedings. Mr. Peterson, she began, her voice clear and calm. Mrs. Caldwell here has agreed to discuss the terms under which she might be willing to authorize the necessary actions regarding the Phoenix Trust. She laid it out formally, establishing the power dynamic from the outset. Robert finally looked at me, a strained, pleading look in his eyes. I met his gaze directly, my expression unreadable. The woman he saw wasn't the one he had left behind. She was older. Yes, but also stronger. Her eyes holding the quiet, hard-won wisdom of 2 decades of survival. As I understand it, Brenda continued, turning to his lawyer, your client requires access to the leverage inherent in the Phoenix Trust to resolve significant legal and financial challenges related to the property it is associated with. Without Mrs. Caldwell's express consent and cooperation, he is unable to do so. The lawyer nodded, reluctantly. That is correct, he murmured, clearly unhappy to admit his client's predicament. Given that Miss Caldwell is the sole legal owner and controller of the Phoenix Trust, Brenda stated, looking directly at Robert now, she is in a position to dictate the terms of its use. She paused, letting the words sink in. Eleanor, she prompted, turning to me. It was my turn, my surprise to deliver. I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the moment, the culmination of 20 years. Robert, I began, my voice steady, clear and carrying across the room. 20 years ago, you left me with nothing. You thought I was incapable of handling the mess you created, of surviving the ruin you left behind. I saw him flinch, his gaze dropping from mine. You were wrong. I didn't just survive. I rebuilt, and in rebuilding, I quietly secured control of something you considered worthless. Something that now, ironically, holds the key to your future. I paused, letting the full weight of the irony settle over him. The Phoenix Trust. You left me in the ashes, and I built something strong there, something that now, you desperately need. You asked for my help, I continued, my voice gaining a quiet intensity. You asked for a signature, a formality. You didn't understand what you were asking for. You were asking me to give you access to the very thing I built from the wreckage you created. You wanted a bailout, but I'm not offering a bailout, Robert. I'm offering terms. I leaned forward slightly, my hands clasped on the table. My terms are not about money, not for me personally. What I need, I've already earned, the hard way. My terms are about accountability, about making amends. Not to me, not directly, but to the consequences of your actions. I looked him squarely in the eye. First, I stated, the words precise and clear. You will publicly acknowledge the financial hardship you caused me 20 years ago. Not a vague apology, but a clear statement detailing the debt you left me with and the difficulties I faced because of your actions. This acknowledgement will be made in writing, signed, and witnessed. His eyes widened in shock. Public acknowledgement. His reputation was everything to him. Second, a significant portion of the funds or value derived from the Phoenix Trust's leverage will not go to you. It will be placed in a charitable trust, administered independently, dedicated to providing financial and legal aid to women who are victims of financial abandonment and marital debt. This wasn't just about me. It was about all the other, a way to turn the wreckage of my past into a lifeline for others. Third, I continued, the terms escalating in their demand for accountability. You will participate publicly in a series of educational seminars for that charitable trust, sharing your story, not from the perspective of a victim, but from the perspective of someone whose actions caused immense harm and who is now facing the consequences. You will be a cautionary tale, a lesson in the real-world impact of financial recklessness and betrayal. His face was pale now, the forced politeness gone, replaced by a look of dawning horror. These terms weren't about money. They were about his pride, his reputation, his carefully constructed public image. They were about forcing him to confront the reality of the damage he had caused, not in private, but in the public sphere he so valued. This is outrageous, his lawyer sputtered, finally finding his voice. You can't demand this. This is extortion. I turned to Brenda, who calmly interjected. These are terms for access to an asset legally owned by Mrs. Caldwell, she stated firmly. She is not demanding payment for something she doesn't own. She is setting conditions for the use of her property. He is free to refuse. However, as we understand it, refusing these terms means he loses the leverage provided by the trust and faces significant financial and legal repercussions. She paused, letting the implication hang in the air. These terms are difficult, perhaps, but they are not illegal. Mrs. Caldwell is not seeking personal financial enrichment. She is seeking a form of restorative justice, leveraging her legal ownership to create something positive from past harm. Robert was staring at me, his face a mask of shock and disbelief. He had come asking for a lifeline, expecting to negotiate a simple financial transaction, perhaps throw a small amount of money my way as a token gesture. He had encountered, Instead, a woman who held the key to his future and was demanding a price measured in accountability and public humility. "I can't do that, Eleanor," he finally stammered, his voice weak. "The public acknowledgement, hot seminars, my reputation." His reputation. Still, after everything, his primary concern. "Your reputation, Robert," I said, my voice hardening, "is something you should have thought about 20 years ago, when you were ruining mine. When you were leaving me to clean up your mess, to face your creditors, to rebuild a life you had deliberately shattered." I leaned back, the moment of delivering the surprise both exhilarating and emotionally draining. "These are my terms. Take them or leave them. The Phoenix Trust remains dormant, and you face the consequences you described, or you agree to face the consequences of your past actions, in the way I've outlined, and gain access to what you need." The air was thick with tension. Robert looked from me to his lawyer, then back to me. His lawyer was whispering urgently in his ear, likely outlining the severity of his situation if he walked away, the potential for bankruptcy, jail, the complete collapse of everything he had built. The irony was palpable. He had built his life on a foundation of sand, built from the wreckage of ours. And now that foundation was crumbling, and the only person who could offer him a solid footing was the woman he had left in the dust. The meeting lasted for another hour, a grueling back and forth where his lawyer tried to negotiate to soften the terms, to find a loophole. But my terms were firm, backed by Brenda's quiet legal authority. I didn't budge. This wasn't a negotiation. It was a presentation of the consequences. Robert sat there, his face a study in humiliation and desperation. He had walked into the room expecting to leverage a technicality with a woman he presumed held no real power, and he found himself at the mercy of the very person he had wronged, a person who had quietly accumulated the power he now needed. Finally, after a hushed conversation with his lawyer, Robert looked at me again. The arrogance was completely gone. What remained was a man facing down utter ruin, confronted by the living embodiment of his past mistakes. I accept," he said, his voice barely audible. "I accept your terms, Eleanor." The words hung in the air, heavy with defeat and surrender. He had begged for help, and I had given him a surprise instead. A surprise that forced him to confront the true cost of his actions. A cost measured not in dollars, but in accountability, in the public dismantling of the image he had so carefully crafted. It wasn't sweet revenge. It was something more profound, a dark redemptive act that sought to turn his past harm into a potential source of aid for others, while forcing him to finally publicly own the damage he had done. The inversion was complete. The betrayed had become the arbiter, the undervalued had found her strength, and the quiet resilience of 20 years had blossomed into a powerful, unexpected force for justice. It was bittersweet, yes. The pain of the past was still there, a faint ache beneath the surface, but alongside it was something new, something strong and undeniable, empowerment. I had not only survived, I had prevailed on my own terms.